there. It is the center of the known world. Paul knows the influence he might have there, and kind of like we talked about last week with Sterling, that opportunity to present the gospel to a captive audience there as he defends himself would be something that would be difficult to measure. So Festus agrees and says, I'll send you to Rome, and Caesar can hear your case there. So every Roman citizen has that right. Paul takes advantage of that right, and he heads on his way there. He's going to be on his way there. So Luke gives us a peek behind the curtain between this discussion about Paul's case, the Jewish king Agrippa II and Festus. Agrippa II is much like the Herods were. In fact, he's in that line. And they are really rulers in name only. They work for the Roman government, and Agrippa meets that same criteria. But he's interested in what Paul has to say. This conversation between the two of them sort of piques the interest of Agrippa. He asks to meet Paul. So Luke gives us this picture of what that looks like, and that's about where we got last week. We closed up last week with Paul sort of beginning his defense with Agrippa in the room. And Festus is there. Bernice, who is Agrippa's sister, is there. Lots of folks in what's described as the audience room. And so Paul begins his defense here in front of Agrippa. And we get just yet another example of just how well-spoken Paul is. How he seeks this common ground with Agrippa and acknowledges that you're a Jew, so you're going to understand what I'm talking about. And Paul also starts off by reminding the group that he was the greatest persecutor of Christians, that he can understand, where they are coming from. And so then he jumps into this section where he's defending Christianity as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. So the big argument the Jews have is that this is false doctrine, false teaching, and instead Paul continues to defend it as right in line with everything that was predicted. So that speech sets the stage for one more telling of the Damascus Road experience, and Paul's going to share his story of his conversion. So he's talking about how important it was for him to persecute Christians, and he's going to share now why he changed his mind. And we've heard this 2 times before. Be on the lookout for some new things that we haven't heard in this telling before as we jump in. 26, 12 through 14. So again, Paul's talking about persecution of Christians. In verse 12, he says, on one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. About noon, King Agrippa, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground. And I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So familiar beginning. We've heard this before, as we've said, and Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. But a new quote pops here we haven't heard before. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So what does that mean? Well, an ox goad was a wooden stick that they would use to prod cattle along. So typically about 8 feet long. And a lot of times it had an iron spike on the end or a point one. It's a sharpened stick, essentially. And as the oxen were pulling a cart, they would stab them from behind to spur them on. So you've heard that term before, right? Somebody goaded me into doing that. They're pushing you down the road by using these sticks. And so when an ox was poked with the goad, they would often kick back against that. Big mistake, right? They would kick out against it in resistance, and it didn't do any good. They continued to get poked with the stick from behind, and then they would hurt themselves in the process. And so you would assume then that ox would figure out that I probably shouldn't kick that sharp stick that they're poking me with. And so Jesus here, Paul says, uses this example to encourage him to understand what's about to happen in his life. So when Jesus says it's hard for you to kick against the goads, really he's saying you're only hurting yourself. You're on the road to Damascus, you're continuing to persecute Christians. It's the same thing as an ox kicking against the sharp stick that's being used to spur them on. You're only hurting yourself by taking these actions against Christians and against Jesus himself. So Saul's continued resistance to the gospel would be a danger to him. God was not going to allow his persecution to go on forever, and Saul had a choice to make. You can continue to hurt yourself and eventually find your own ruin, or you can give in to the gospel message and become a missionary for that. And so that's a quote we hadn't seen before pop up, and Paul uses that here as he's talking to the folks in the audience room. 15 through 18, then I asked, "Who are you, Lord?" I am Jesus who you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness of what you have seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So a really good synopsis of Paul's mission here, isn't it? He was taking another opportunity here between probably what's a mixed crowd of Jews and Gentiles, but takes the opportunity here to remind the folks that are listening, this audience, that Gentiles have an equal share in inheritance, that they may receive forgiveness of sin, a place among those who are sanctified by me. This inheritance that the Gentiles have access to is the promise that was made to Abraham from the beginning. And the Jews like to confine it to themselves only, but Paul continues to push to his own detriment that the Gentiles are included. He kind of makes reference to this in Ephesians 2:19. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. So Paul's message at the root was that there's no more Jews and Gentiles, there's only God's children. And everybody falls into that category. He's sharing that as he shares this story. So what do we think about the comparison of this telling to the previous two? Well, the similarity is that it's really these details that stay for the most part the same of Paul's encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. The first time we heard it in Acts 9, it was a third-person account. So Luke's telling the story as he had heard it and from a third-person account. In Acts 22 and 26, we're hearing directly from Paul. There's value there, right? And we get some aspects of the story in both of those tellings that we hadn't heard in the third-person account in Acts 9. So that was important. Acts 22 was more geared towards the Jewish background and a focus on Ananias, who, if you recall, was ministering to Paul when he arrived in Damascus. That's how his sight was restored. And here in Acts 26, there's this more of this detail about the gospel that Paul was going to give to the